So, of course, I'd like to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're discussing something very exciting, the new release management and approval workflows in Onshape. So, really new functionality, exciting functionality for us that allows you to do really things you've never been able to do before in Onshape. So, we're going to focus on this new functionality. I'm going to walk you through examples of using it, how to set it up, and all the little details that you'll need to get started. This is meant to be kind of a general introduction into release management. It's definitely a very complex topic, in-depth topic, and this is meant to kind of get you started in understanding the workflows, the various options, how to interact with release management, obsoleting designs, those types of things. Now, as I always say with these webinars, we really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question that you'd like, and I'll do my best to stop and answer the questions as we go through today's webinar. All right, so let's dig into it. The agenda today is pretty straightforward. There's not much more to it besides an introduction to release management and approval workflows. That's really what we're going to focus on. How do we turn it on? What do the various options mean? How do we interact with release management? What are the ways that we use it inside of Onshape? I do want to just briefly mention some things that are different about release management when you compare it to something like an old PDM system. So just keep that in mind. I have a few key things to point out as we go through things here. It's just little things that are important to keep in mind if you come from like an EPDM or some other PDM system that was file-based. And then I want to show you some of the capabilities. We're going to walk through not just a simple example. We'll start with a simple example, but I'm going to get into, releasing assemblies, releasing combinations of things, linked documents, configurations. How do we manage all of those details of release management as well? Of course, as I always say again, feel free to ask any question that you'd like. There's the questions section there, and I will do my best to stop and answer any questions. So let's dig into it. I want to start with a simple introduction into release management and approval workflow. So what is release management and approval workflows? Put it simply, it's an integrated formal release management tool for your company. It's important to stress this is specific to companies in Onshape, which implies Onshape Professional subscription. So this is only for Onshape Professional subscribers, but it's a company level function. What you're doing here is turning on, as an admin or an owner, a company level release management process. Now, it's important to keep in mind, when you compare this kind of functionality with an older PDM system, we've done what a lot of those older PDM systems have done in the background for many years now. The version management, the history, all of that's been core Onshape for a very long time, since the beginning. And those are PDM level functions today, generally in old CAD systems. What we haven't been able to do is manage your designs via an approval workflow, meaning a design is in a certain state, it transitions to another state, people are notified, there's approvers in the design. That kind of workflow has never really been easily possible in Onshape. And that's what those older PDM systems give you, that ability to control your data via that workflow. So we're kind of completing the last aspect of that puzzle when we talk about, what do we need to really give, you a formal release process. Right. So the kind of quintessential example I can give you is the workflow. You'll see the screenshot there of the workflow. That's kind of what everyone sees when they think of, a PDM system and managing their data, is managing it through that workflow. We're going to go over the specifics of that workflow and the obsolete workflow later, and some of the details of working with it. But that's kind of the key graphic that I could give you, is you're controlling your process via these states and automation workflows. So that is a simple explanation of release management. What I want to point out is how it differs from older PDM systems. So if you have experience with an EPDM or a Windchill, those types of applications, they are different in quite a few ways. So one of the first things I would point out is Onshape's release management tools, the approval workflows, it's all integrated into Onshape. So there's no separate application. There's no management of a separate application, right? There's no setup of a separate application. Everything that you're doing, from this setup of release management to using release management, all aspects of it are fully integrated into Onshape. So you go to the same menu account settings to add users is turn on release management. It's not a separate package you have to manage. So that's one of the first things I would point out that is different when you compare, an older, more traditional PDM system to Onshape. It's not a separate application you have to manage. So as an admin or an owner of a company, you're going to have release management, as an option, and you simply turn it on. It's an option in your account settings. The other thing to point out, I've already briefly mentioned this, is there's no check-in and check-out with Onshape, and that's been that way since the beginning. That's not different with release management, of course, but it's one of the things to stress. So all of these workflows that I'm going to show you, all these examples that I'm going to show you, just realize that at no point am I checking in or checking out or waiting for someone to check in or waiting for someone to check out. That check-in, check-out process is never an issue. It's never blocking you. You're never waiting for someone to check something in so that you can, release a design. And that isn't a thing in Onshape. You don't have to worry about that. So there's no, check-in, check-out exchange of files in Onshape that is really a huge part of old PDM systems. That's almost its primary function. So no check-in and check-out, and that's been that way since the very beginning. That's not new. History, versions, all of that stuff has been what has traditionally been in a PDM system. That's always been in Onshape. Now we're just adding an extra layer to it. The other thing I would point out is it's far easier to use, and a lot of that stems from it being fully integrated. You literally, to release something, right-click, hit release. There's no special UI. There's no separate application you have to go to. There's no windows that have to fly out independently. It's in the same right-click menu where you rename or delete or edit, right? It's exactly in that space. So it's functionally, it doesn't feel like you're going anywhere else or doing anything else or working with any other software. And in that sense, it's generally easier to use. And that's pervasive throughout the application. You'll see releases in the versions in history. You'll have the same right-click menu options. You can compare, revisions. All of that stuff is core Onshape. We're just building a kind of a new wrapper around it, right, to address this important need for workflows. So important things to stress, fully integrated. We don't have a check-in or out, and it's just far simpler to use than, more manual, older, PDM system. All right, so let's get into what can I release. That's the next question that I often get asked is, you're creating a release management software, right? We're creating a release management tool. What can I release? And the short answer is basically everything. Parts, assemblies, drawings, configurations, and even imported files can be included in a release candidate. So it's important to keep in mind, this applies to more than just your CAD models, right, or your CAD data in general. It's more than just parts, assemblies, and drawings. It can be individual configurations. You can release configurations independently of one another. You can release multiple configurations of the same part in the same release candidate. Right, that's something that you really have never been able to do with a file-based system, because at the file-based system, the file is the holder of all the data. That's the thing that gets passed on in the workflow. So it's unique in the sense that you can do that. You can release configurations independently of another. You can also, of course, all of this applies to imported files. So you can release imported files. You can Rev manage imported files. You can assign part numbers to imported files automatically. So there's lots of things this allows you to do that are outside of just the core models that you're building. And I want to stress that, because keep in mind, there's going to be PDFs. There's going to be, individual drawings or maybe legacy data, CAD data that needs to be in the document and also needs to be released and controlled in the same way that your Onshape data is. So that's one of the more commonly asked questions. Basically, you can release anything. I say basically, the only exception I can think of, and it's just a caveat more than anything, is part studios. In Onshape, you don't release a part studio. All the parts within it, yes, of course, but the part studio itself isn't a thing that gets released. So that's one caveat that I would stress as we're digging into it. All right, so that's one other thing before I move on. You can release any combination of these as well. So it's not like only assemblies or only parts or only certain things. It's any combination of those. So you can release a couple of parts and a drawing and a random PDF, right? Just you choose what's included in your release candidate, and it can be any combination of things that you want. Right? All right, so let's jump into release management and the approval workflows. As I mentioned before, feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a question section there in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question that you'd like, and I'll do my best to stop and answer the questions from time to time as we start digging in. All right, so let's get into it. Now, the most obvious natural starting point here, let's just jump into the documents page, is how do I turn on release management? That's step one in the process, of course. It's important to keep in mind this is specific to Onshape Professional subscribers, right? This is specific to your company, right? So when you turn on release management, you're turning it on for every company-owned document. That's an important thing to stress. So think of it as a company-level function like custom properties or adding users, which means turning it on is a function of the admin or the owner of the company. Right, that's step one. Make sure that you're either the admin or the owner of a company before you can do any of what I'm going to show you right now. Right? If you're not that role, you'll need to reach out to that person and have them turn on release management so that you can use these features. So that's an important first caveat. But as the admin or owner of a company, if you go to your account settings, so in your username in the top right, you go to My Account. We have all your account preferences, right? And most importantly, you have your company settings down here. As an admin or owner, you're going to see these company settings. And you have properties, you can add users, we have different preferences that you can specify, but the new option is release management. So this is the new option in your account settings. So this is what I mean by integrated. Turning on release management is literally an option in your settings. The same settings where you specify units and things like that. So under your company, just below properties and users, you have this option for release management. By default, this will be set to manual, right? Manual creates versions and manages the properties yourself, literally changing the state and things yourself. You've been able to do this in the past just by manually editing properties and established versions. And that's kind of been the workflow of the past. What you have now is this option for Onshape default workflows. Turning on this option turns on release management. So that's really the only thing you have to do. You have to click this radio button and hit the big save, right? That turns on release management, period. So there's not anything more that you really have to do. Now, of course, you're going to want to configure it to match what you do. And so I want to walk through that, and we're going to go through all the things that you can configure. But keep in mind, all you really need to do if you just want to turn it on is click Onshape default workflows. That will turn on release management. Now, of course, you'll want to go through and establish what is my revision scheme. You know, what kind of part numbering structure do I want? What kind of various admin level permissions do I want? Right? What kind of things do I want only the admin to be able to do? So there are things that you'll want to go through as an admin or owner, but it's very simple to get started. So I'm going to take this from top to bottom. We've turned on the default workflows, right? We have our release workflow and our obsolete workflow. And I'm going to go over both of those in just a bit and how we get data into an obsolete state. But it's important to keep in mind every design goes through this workflow. As of today, this is April 5th, 2018. There's no custom workflows as of today, right? So everyone using release management is using this workflow that you're seeing here. One of these two, and the obsolete workflow is pretty straightforward, but it's really intended for obsolete designs. But the released workflow is where you're going to spend, your data is going to spend its time. And so it's important to kind of briefly walk through this and explain what it means. So on the left here, we have where it starts. That's the create anything. So when you create a new document, create a part or an assembly or a drawing within it, it starts immediately in progress, right? And it stays in the in progress state until you decide to release it. And I'm going to go over these and how to do these in just a bit, but just briefly walk you through the workflow. You release the design, and then it does one of two things. You either require an approver or you don't. If you do require an approver, it will go into a pending state, waiting for that approver to approve, or approvers, plural, if you have multiple approvers. If you don't require an approval, let's say that you're a small company, or maybe you're the only CAD user and you approve your own designs and you still want to use release management, you just don't want to go through the approval process of your own designs, kind of silly, just go no, and to release. And I'll explain what that means in a bit. But that's what this approval required means, and that's the step in the workflow. Once it gets to pending, the person or persons, right, multiple persons or people, will approve. And if they approve, it goes into the released state, right? So just keep in mind, when you go into that released state, it can require a single approver, it can require multiple approvers. And they can also reject, of course, and that will send it into the rejected state. So important to keep in mind, this is the general flow of the approval workflow. Now, you can have approvers or not. That's up to you, and it's an option I'll show you in just a moment. And that definitely affects where it goes. Right, as a if I don't require approvers, then I can go immediately as my sole permission as admin to go straight to released. But more than likely, you're going to have people approving the design and require approvals for the design. And if that's the case, then you'll go into this pending state. So I hope that makes sense. That's the default release workflow that all release management goes through. Right. So when you turn on default workflows, you immediately enter this default workflow. All right, so moving on, we get into revisions and part numbers. Bear with me for one moment. Quick question. Can I change the starting value for an automatic part numbering at any time? For instance, if I create some part numbers outside of Onshape, can I skip them when I want to have Onshape generate part numbers later? You could click Next and increment this number up. So we'll get to that in just a moment, so bear with me. Okay, so let's start with revision scheme. There are two automated styles of revision schemes for you to choose from. Now, it's important to keep in mind, this is how you specify how the revisions will increment. So when you release a design, it automatically increments a revision, right? And how it increments, what scheme it uses is dictated here, right? So you have alphabetical, you have numerical. And these are pretty straightforward. You either prefer A, B, C, D, so on, or numerical 1, 2, 3, so on. These do conform to different standards, so you'll see skipping I, O, Q, S, X, and Z. That's a standard that it's conforming to based on the alphabetical scheme. But it's up to you to define what scheme that you want. Right? So those are the two to choose from. You choose either alphabetical or numerical. Then we get into part number generation. Now, there's two ways to do part number generation. Manual entry, which is kind of what we've done in the past, literally typing in a part number for the property. Or you have this option for an automatic part number generation, a sequential part number generation. And there is some logic to it. You can specify a prefix, an assembly, drawing and file prefix, so it can be specific to the type of thing that you're working with. You can specify a minimum length and the next value. Now, it will give you a preview of the finished result here. So it's very much like you're building your part number generation here, right? And so you can see I have PRT-015, and I can hit this up arrow if I want to manually increment that number up. And I think that somewhat answers the question of, can I skip numbers? If I went in and manually assigned a part number, could I come in here and skip the instances up? No. The answer is yes, you could. Another caveat I want to stress is, with this on, you can't, or with this period, with enterprise, or excuse me, with release management and the things that we have for the ability to control for the workflow, you can't have redundant part numbers. You can't have part numbers that are the same. And so what I mean by that is, if you try to type in a part number that's already been used, you will get an error saying you can't go forward. They must be unique. So important caveat to keep in mind with release management is you must have unique part numbers. Now, this part number generation tool just makes it easy to generate all the part numbers sequentially for you. In fact, there's a button you can click that will automatically generate part numbers for all the parts in your release candidate if you want to. But it's a way to automate that process, right? Question: can you use the project category in properties to generate your part number, for example? No, there's no way outside of this simple min length next value incrementer, the sequential generator. There's no way to link this to any other properties or data at this moment. I would encourage you, I know that part number generation is one of those things that can vary company to company. I would encourage you to use the feedback tool and let us know if what kind of workflow would you like to see. So just keep that in mind. Question: minimum length of what? The prefix? No, of the number. Right. So you can see 019. That's min length 3. How does Onshape ensure that a previously released body part in Onshape Workspace doesn't ever get a new part number? It will show you an error if you type in a part number that's already been used. So important to keep in mind, if you type in a part number, or if you happen to have a part number already in place that's already been used, you will see an error when you try to release it that says part numbers must be unique, right? So it is checking that. Right, and it's checking it throughout Onshape, not specific to a document or anything like that. So even if I create a part, give it a part number, and then move that part to another document, I don't have to worry about reusing part numbers. Throughout Onshape, part numbers have to be unique with this, and you'll get an error if they're not, if you try and do something besides that. Right? All right, so then we get into the various options, and there are kind of 3 categories of options to consider for how you want your release management to be set up. The first option that I want to mention: only administrators can edit the properties of released objects. Right, important to keep in mind, if you want to be able to go back and edit properties associated with released objects after the release has been completed, you'll need this checkbox checked. Right, as an admin, that's an occasional function that you may want to do as an admin that you may not necessarily want everyone doing. So if you ever have a need to go back and edit the properties of a released object after it's been released, you'll need that checked. Important thing to keep in mind. Another one: only administrators can mark objects as not revision managed. I'm going to get into this in greater detail in just a bit. There's a checkbox for non-revision managed. It's been there for a while, actually. This will allow you to control who can set that. Right? And then finally, only administrators can delete documents containing released objects. This is a very important thing to consider as an administrator. Once something is released, who can delete that document? Right? So once you have a document with a released design, who should have permission to delete that? And there's a checkbox there that forces it, to only administrators, right? And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Generally speaking, the engineers will have the ability to delete documents unless it's been released, and if you have that checked and want to control that. But a very important one to consider if you're concerned about released documents getting accidentally deleted. All right, so those are the various access permissions. The next one that I want to mention is the various release conditions. The key thing to keep in mind here is anything you check here will block a release candidate from going through, will prevent a release from being created, from being released, right? So these are scenarios where I don't want a part with rebuild errors being released. I don't want a drawing that hasn't been rebuilt being released. Those kinds of scenarios. In fact, those are 2 of the checkbox options. So let's discuss them. When releasing a part, if its Part Studio feature list contains errors, so if you have a Part Studio with errors and you're trying to release it, this will prevent that from happening and will force you to go back and fix those errors before it can be released. Right? So that's a checkbox option. When releasing a part, if its Part Studio feature list is rolled back, if the rollback bar is not at the end, so if you rolled back in the design and then you try and release it, this will error out and will prevent you, if this is checked, prevent you from releasing it until that's rolled back to the end. Finally, of course, when releasing an assembly, if its assembly list contains errors. So if you have errors in your assembly, you can prevent that. So these are all fairly straightforward. Basically, if you have errors in your geometry or the assembly, you must address them before a design could be released. If you want that, check these boxes. The one that I would recommend, and the one that I would, if I had to choose one to point out as recommended, in fact, I think it's even on by default, is when releasing a drawing if it has a pending update. And this means that if a drawing hasn't been updated to reflect a change, you can't release it. And the reason I think this is important is because it's very easy to make a design change to the model, to the 3D model, even the parts and the assemblies, and to forget about the drawing. And then you have a released drawing that hasn't been updated to reflect the changes made in the model. There's lots of potential problems that can come from that. So it sounds like kind of an obvious thing. It's just one of those things that if it isn't checked, I recommend it. It will ensure that all of your drawings have been updated to reflect the changes that are most likely being, the reason for you re-releasing, right? So one thing to consider, it just means that if a drawing hasn't been updated, you will be forced to go into that drawing and update that drawing before it can be added to a release candidate. All right, so those are the various release conditions. Again, keep in mind, those are the things that will stop a release from going forward. Those will prevent it from moving forward. So now let's get into the specifics of the release dialog. So the release candidate dialog is the thing that you interact with to build your release candidate. So you right-click on whatever it is that you want to release, you click release, and it brings up the release candidate. What you see in that release candidate dialog depends on the options set by the admin here, right? So they're fairly straightforward, but I want to mention them. Starting at the top, require an approver in the release dialog. I showed you a moment ago where there's an option, approval required or not. This is the checkbox that covers that. So if you're a single engineer, or if you're the owner, the admin, and the only person, and you still want to use release management, you would probably uncheck this, right? Because you are the approver, and there's no need to go through a formal approval process. Right? You still get the benefits of using the workflow and interacting with it and having the design in states and so on, but you're not having someone else approve the design. Right? That's the key thing to keep in mind. So if that's you would want this unchecked, right? Because you're the approver, you just want to move it into the release design. There's no point in having an approver. However, I think that many out there that are using release management need approvers. Right? That's the workflow that they're looking for. And so it's important to keep in mind, if your company wants a formal approval process by others, you need this checked, right? So require an approval in the release dialog. So it means it's a forced field. You must fill it out in order for a release candidate to be submitted. So fairly straightforward. The other thing to keep in mind about that is you can have multiple approvers, right? If I comma separate values, if say for instance I'm adding myself and another person, I want both of them to approve of it. I can say, C. Armstrong at Onshape.com, comma, Joe Dunn at Onshape.com. And so I can comma separate people and have multiple approvers when I'm filling out my list of approvers. And that leads to the next option, require approval from all approvers. So in that scenario where you have more than one person listed as the approver, do you need just one of them or all of them to approve? And that's essentially what this checkbox controls. So if you find yourself in the scenario where we require multiple approvers, and we need that as part of our workflow, it's not one of any of this group, it's all of this group. That's where you would check require approver from all approvers. And then all the names listed as approvers must approve before it can move on to the next state, the released state, right? So important thing to keep in mind, if that's your workflow. If your company requires approvers, more than one approver to move on, you'll need this checked, right? The last one, require a note in the release dialog. This is fairly straightforward. Do you want some kind of a note or a description related to the release? Do you want to force that as a thing? Right? Do you need that bit of information? So it's up to you whether you check that. It depends on your workflow, but just keep in mind, you can require the user to type in some kind of a note, description, bit of information that relates to the release to give it some context. All right, so that's all the various options Again, keep in mind, this is recording on April 5th, 2018. This is going to evolve very quickly. We just announced this a few weeks ago now, and we're gonna see it evolve very quickly as with all things Onshape. So let's talk about using it. We've talked about how to set it up as an admin, how to go through the various settings and things. What I'd like to discuss next is how to actually use release management as a user. Important last step, make sure to click Save Release Settings. Before you do anything, make sure that you click Save Release Settings. Right? That will make sure that any of these settings that you've adjusted are actually saved and used going forward. All right, so how do we interact with release management? How do we use release management as engineers? And there are a few key things that I want to stress, and I want to start really simple and then kind of get into the more elaborate scenarios of interacting with release management. So we're going to start with a simple part and then get into releasing, inserting, and all those kinds of details. All right, so let's get started. Now, it's important to keep in mind releasing a design is available in the right-click menu, right? So if you right-click a part, if you right-click an assembly, if you right-click a tab, you're going to see this option for release. And it really depends what you want to release. If I want to release just this one part within this part studio, I would right-click just that one part and choose release. If I wanted to right-click an entire assembly, I might right-click the tab for the assembly and choose release. That would bring in all the parts related to it. But it's important to keep in mind, as I mentioned before, you can release any combination of parts, assemblies, drawings, configurations, imported files. It's up to you what you want to include. But to get started, it's really just a matter of right-clicking and choosing the option to release. As I mentioned before, this is what I mean by fully integrated. Right? You see it in the same right-click menu as rename and so on. So I right-click and I choose the option to create a release. Right? That option to release, it brings up the window to create a release candidate. And this is kind of the whole package, so to speak, that goes with the release. So this is where you structure all the things that you want to be in the release notes, the release name, who's going to approve this release, all of that specified in this release candidate. Question: can the release note be connected to the drawing? I fill in a Rev table on a drawing. I think so. I think what you would do there is you would link to something like a field like state, right? Because we're setting the state, and I'm assuming based on your Rev table comment that state is something you want to see, or the revision, of course. But those things are automatically being generated. So the revision, the state, the part number, those things are controlled by release management. And in the drawing, we're really just linking to that property, right? So yeah, I don't think anything changes in that regard. You would just insert a note and link to the part number property or the state property or the revision property, for instance. And that would be how you'd link to your Rev table. Okay, so we've clicked release. We've started up our release candidate. A few things to keep in mind. This part studio that I right-clicked on had 2 parts in it. Remember, we can have multiple parts in a part studio. So I'm actually releasing both of these parts, right? Not just one or the other. When you right-click a part studio, it chooses all the parts in that part studio. You'll also notice that I don't have part numbers assigned for these just yet, right? Now, I can just click in here and start typing if I prefer that manual approach, or I can click the button to generate missing part numbers. And if I have, a dozen or so parts, it will just go all the way through from top to bottom and sequentially add part numbers to them. So this follows that scheme that we set up in the options just a moment ago. And this is how you do it on a large scale, right? If you just want to do it across the board from top to bottom, you click this button and it assigns all of them. Of course, you can click this button for each individual thing within your release candidate. So if you want to assign, part numbers to just a few things and not everything, you can click this and do that. But clicking the icon here at the top, that assigns it from top to bottom sequentially. Okay. The other thing you could do, of course, is edit the properties. You can see we have revision, state, and part number, but of course there's a lot of other metadata that you may want to adjust. So if you click edit properties, that will take you into the same properties that you would see under the workspace properties, where you can edit description, project, all those other details, right? So that's the edit properties. The other thing to mention is you can add or remove from the release candidate. So you're not limited by the thing that you right clicked on. So if I wanted to remove something, I could click the X. That would remove that one thing from the release candidate. If I wanted to add something, I could click the plus symbol. Right? Click add to release and then go in and find something else that I want to add. As mentioned, you can choose any combination of things. I can choose parts, I could choose assemblies, I could choose files, drawings, whatever it is that I want to include in that release candidate, right? You can also, of course, search by the release candidate, search through the release candidates, especially you get into releasing large designs at once. It becomes very useful. But really, aside from that, defining those initial details, it's really just a matter of defining what's the release name, what is the notes you want to associate with your release, and who is going to approve this release. Right? Those are the kind of key caveats that you must do before you can actually submit it. All right, questions. Is there a way to export all the parts in a release candidate? For instance, if I release 20 parts in drawings, I still have to download them individually. Of course, I could just link the vendor to the release because they can still get to the other workspaces. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't just link a vendor to the release because they can still get to the other workspaces currently. Yes, it is a good point. Unfortunately, I think the short answer is no today. But I do know that others have requested it. I'm not sure if you have too, but I've heard just kind of loosely thrown Onshape of the need for that kind of functionality. So if you haven't already submitted it, something tells me you have, but if you haven't already, please do. As of today, there's no automated way to say download everything at the released state, as I release it or even later. It's still an individual thing. Yeah, I think that's the short answer. Can you automatically assign a part number to a part prior to starting the release process? I would like to add the part number earlier in the design phase. Good question. Hold on one second. You know what? Let's come back to that. I'm not 100% certain. I think the answer is no. I think the only way to interact with that automatic part number generation is through the release candidate. The only question I would have is maybe in the versions, or maybe in the workspace properties. So let me come back to that at the end and double check that. I'm fairly certain the answer is no. I think as of today, the automatic assigning is only done at the release candidate stage. All right. So as I mentioned before, release name, approvers, release notes. What you choose to put into these fields is up to you. We've seen a lot of different things in terms of release name. You may have revision. You may have ECO number. That's another common one. So we see where you enter the ECO number and you type in any kind of release notes. Let's say, initial release extended. Right, so I add some miscellaneous release notes, and then I define my approvers. Now, you remember from earlier, I require approvers, and required fields show up in orange, red. So you're going to see these red fields indicating you must fill this out. And so it's up to me to define who are my approvers. And I could just type in a simple email address. I can type in multiple. So if I decide I need to start adding multiple approvers, I can just add one, then add another, and then add another. And even with that checkbox mentioned earlier, require all of them approve before it's actually released. So how you define that is up to you. Most companies we talk to, that's very much an independent thing. They all vary, and sometimes it's one of this group, sometimes it's all of this group, sometimes, it's a combination of those. So just keep in mind, that's how you specify approvers. It's up to you, who you want involved. The last thing to keep in mind is the concept of an observer. An observer, like that implies, is just kept in the loop, so to speak. So they're notified of actions regarding it. So basically that it's been created and that it's been released, you're going to see that as an observer. So if you know of someone who isn't responsible for approving it, but just wants to be in the loop on the approval, state, where it's at in the approval process, it's an excellent thing to just put them in as the observer, just so they're notified of where this is at. Right. So you don't need to do this for yourself. As the person creating the release candidate, you're going to be notified of that. But if you know of anyone else in your company that wants to be aware, you can do that. You can add them as an observer. So that's really it. Once you've defined, what things do you want to release, right? What part numbers, if you haven't already specified those, then it's really just a matter of clicking submit. Now, there is about a minute or so delay, at least, in that initial notification, right? A task is run out, and then what you'll see is you'll actually get notified as an approver right inside of Onshape. Right? So as an approver, I'm going to get a little notification saying, hey, you must approve this design. And this is outside of the document. So I could be in a totally other document, and I get this notification. I click View Release, and now I'm looking at the release candidate, as the approver that needs to review this. Right? Now, as the approver that needs to review this, one important tip that I would give you is you can click links and go straight to the document from here. Very useful if you're not currently in that document, right? But you want to get to it quickly to review it. Chances are, if you're reviewing this, you want to look at it, right, before you say okay. And this is the fastest way to get to it, these links that you'll see in the release candidate. The other details are straightforward. You have your revision, your part numbers, you have all the details that are here, and it's up to you. You can release it, you can reject it, or you can just discard it altogether. Reject goes into the rejected state. Released, of course, goes into the released state. And discard means it doesn't go forward and it goes back. So those are, again, fairly straightforward. It's up to you to define, as an approver, or if you have multiple approvers, it's up to multiple approvers to define what they do from this point, right? Question. When approval is pending, what keeps someone else from making changes to the part? Nothing. And one of the things to keep in mind is you can have a design pending and it can keep being modified. There's remember that the moment in history where you submitted the release is always there and can always be restored back to. That's one of the benefits of working this way is, I can release something, open it up, and keep right on working on it. And maybe I'm already working on Rev 2 and they just needed the release out. And I'm already working on Rev 2 without having to go through the whole ECO, the formal process of moving it back into place. So, I would say that's one of the things to keep in mind. You can always just restore back to where a point was when you created a release candidate. It's no different than a version in that sense. But one of the benefits is because we're not dependent on check-in or out or any of those kinds of things, you could keep right on moving. Right? You can keep right on designing. That pending state will always stay there. That's a snapshot at that moment in time. When they do the review, they're looking at that moment in time. They're not looking at the latest, right? So if you uncheck approval required box from earlier, does the red asterisk go away here? Yes. Yes. What does ECO stand for those of us in smaller companies? Engineering Change Order. There's also engineering change number, ECN. There's a number of different names for this process, but essentially it's a change request to an existing approved design. And that's kind of the process that it goes through. It's referred to as an engineering change order, engineering change request that involves engineering change numbers, and there's a whole formal process that goes involved with it. Is it possible to attach a document such as ECO number description in the release? Is it possible to attach document such as ECO number description in the release? I'm not sure I totally understand what you mean by attach document such as. You can search by it. I don't know if attach means like insert into a node or something along those lines. It is a piece of metadata that's referenceable, or it's at least searchable. Forgive me, I'm not totally sure I follow. The other thing to point out about this, while I'm still in the review release candidate, as the approver, I can release this, reject this, discard this from my phone, right? The same release candidate functionality works on a mobile device as well, right? So just keep that in mind. You can release your designs, you can reject designs, you can discard designs from your mobile device. We've built that in from the very beginning. So this works just as easily on a mobile device as it does on in the browser. Oh, I'm sorry. This is in relation to the question earlier. You can release it as a file. I think I understand the question earlier. This is a good point. Is it possible to attach a document, such as ECO, whatever, description in the release? Yes, you can import a file, if that's what you mean by a document. So if you import a file, and I know it's very common for the ECO process to have a PDF or some kind of document that goes with it, yes, you can absolutely import that into a document and include that in your release candidate. Absolutely. How do you know what state a file is in? How do I know that what my files are in my project are released or waiting for approval? Sorry if this was answered already. So I think, the big thing I would stress is in the release candidate, you're going to see state right here. So pending. So if you're looking at a release candidate or if you're generating a release candidate, you're going to see that. Now, if you're not in a release candidate, the easiest way that I'd recommend is either the bill of materials, having the simultaneous bill of materials on in the assembly. That's an easy way. You could just turn on the state, or just search from the documents page. I would search by anything in the release state or anything in the pending state, and you can do that from the documents page. And you could search by combinations of things. So I could search by anything that starts with PN-10 that's released. Right? I could search by combinations of those types of things. But if you're not familiar with it, the advanced search in the documents page is probably the easiest way to quickly get to everything that's in a released state, for instance. Now, we've also done little things to make inserting released parts or assemblies easier. So I'll go over this in just a bit, but if your question is, how do I easily find something that's released and insert it into a drawing? Or how do I easily find something that's released and insert it into the assembly? I'm going to show you an example of that in a bit. In the insert dialog, we've made that easier by a filter. All right, so we've released our designs. I'm going to click the big release button, and now we have our actual release approved, right? I just had the one approver. I've approved it, and now it's been formally approved. By the way, I mentioned the notification in Onshape, but there's also a notification as well via email, right? So you're going to see an email notification if you're not in Onshape when the ECO has been created and you're the approver. You're going to see an email saying, here is the release. Would you please take a look at it? And you have a big button that says go to release. So even if you're not in Onshape, you're going to be notified that a release has been, a candidate has been created, or if a release design goes through, you'll be notified that it's also been approved. When the released version A is submitted for approval in the pending state, is that noted in the version history in the document? So very good question. So forgive me, I have not mentioned this, and this is very important to the workflow. In the versions in history, you're going to see released designs have a solid triangle. Right? Now, pending designs will have a hollow triangle in versions in history. Right? So very important thing to keep in mind. You'll see that visual cue, and this is not just in versions in history, but also insert and basically anywhere where you browse the versions, you will see either a hollow triangle or a solid triangle. Solid triangle is released. Hollow triangle means pending, not yet released. So that's your visual cue. Now, the other one more aspect of this we haven't covered is obsolete. You can obsolete a revision, and then it will have this with a cross. It's another big, kind of visual indicator. But yes, that's kind of your visual cue, and that's not just in version history, but insert as well. That's your visual cue. A solid triangle means released. All right, so let's go into that. Let's jump into this bike frame example, for instance, and what I'd like to do is insert. Now, what I want to point out here is you could, of course, browse to other documents, right? So if I go to other documents and I browse to this suspension pivot arm here, I can browse to it and choose any of the released versions. Now, one of the quick things to filter by is released items. So in the insert dialog, you have this button that says view released items, and this will filter by things that are only things that are released. So the short answer to the question, can I force the user to only insert, released items? This is the easiest way. Click the filter, and they will only be able to insert released parts, released assemblies, and so on. right? Very useful, especially for the drawing. If you're trying to create drawings of released parts, if that's part of your workflow, you can say, I only want to insert released items, right? Now, in this case, it's no different than any other. If I click here and then I drag and drop in, it shows me, that inserted part. Of course, I see that same solid triangle indicating that it is a released part. So that's your visual cue. Now, if you want to change things, you can update link document no different than if it were linked to a version. And this has existed for some time now, but you can change what it's linked to if you choose to in the future. So just keep that in mind. The solid triangle is that visual cue that this is a release design. And when you go to insert, whether it's the drawing or the assembly or even other functions, basically anywhere where you can insert, you'll have that option for released. All right, so that is the insertion of released parts into the design. What I'd like to go over next is how do we move a design out of that released version. So let's go over just real quickly releasing the design again. So let's make a design change, and let's go back and say, I'm just going to make a simple design change here. All right. And what I'd like to do is re-release this design. Right? Now, what I would do is right-click and choose, of course, again to release. And what you'll see is it's automatically incrementing both of these parts. So revision A is now going to revision B according to my revision scheme that I specified earlier. And I can input new data, new ECO numbers, new descriptions, let's say shorter and longer. All right. Yeah, shorter and longer. And let's say, Onshape mold. I'll click submit. Now we're submitting a second release candidate, right? So now we're resubmitting it and it's being bumped, so to speak, to the next revision, right? And so you're going to see the same process. You're going to see the notification pop up as the approver. You're going to have to go through and approve it if you'd like, right? So I'm going to go through and say, okay, this looks good. And now those are going to get into Rev B. Now I've re-released the design. It's been modified. I could even compare the two right there from that release candidate. But for the sake of time, let's say that I have Rev A, I have Rev B, and I no longer want Rev A to be accessible. Right? I no longer want Rev A to be inserted into anything else. Right? One of the easiest ways you can accomplish this is by doing what we call obsoleting, or moving it into the obsolete workflow. So if I right-click a part or anything that's been released, anything really, but anything that's been released is what's going to apply to, you'll see an option for revision history. If you right-click any part or assembly, basically anything that's been released, you'll see this option for revision history, and it's going to list out all of the history associated with that thing, right? That part or that assembly. Or, again, drawing or imported file or configuration. But again, you'll see the history of it. And what you have is this option to obsolete the revision. And what that will do is move it into the obsolete workflow. This just tags it as obsolete. This must be approved in my case because I have that option checked. So someone else must approve this being obsolete. But the most important thing that this does is it means that you do not have the option to choose this when inserting, right? It's going to hide this as an option when inserting. So I think that's the primary use of this obsolete workflow. It's really not much different than creating a release candidate, except you're moving into obsolete and say, this is outdated for reason X, right? And it could say, here's my approver, and hit submit. And it has to be approved in the same way that a release candidate is approved. But once that happens, then you won't have that option to insert. So I think that's the key kind of workflow that I would recommend there is if you find yourself in a scenario where you have multiple revisions and you don't want someone accidentally inserting one of them that you just don't want to use anymore, obsolete is kind of the way to do that. And again, you just right click on the thing that you want to make obsolete, or the thing that has a revision you want to make obsolete, and you'll see that option revision history, right? That's how you bring it up. And again, you have to approve it, right? So if I go in, I have to say obsolete, reject, or discard. And once I say obsolete, then it's made obsolete. I don't see that. I no longer see it as an option when inserting. All right, so I know I've covered quite a few things. We have 5 minutes left, and I have quite a few questions that I want to make sure that I answer. These are just frequently asked questions. I encourage you to ask any questions there. We still have 5 minutes now to answer any questions regarding release management. I'll do my best to answer all of them. But I have a few of my own that I've brought together just based on questions we've overheard so far. I've already discussed some of these, so forgive me. But what about multiple approvers? Yes, we've discussed that. You can force multiple approvers, or you can force one of the approvers. And you just simply type in their names as in the approvers field. You can have as many as you like. What about custom workflows? That's one of the most common questions. No, not yet. Again, if you're watching this recording, this is April 5th, 2018. That's not going to be a limitation forever. But as of today, you have the release workflow and the obsolete workflow, and those are the two that you have to use. The other question I get asked often is, how do versions and releases interact, right? We can still create versions, and how do versions and releases interact? And I think the simple explanation is versions are milestones in the design. Think of any scenario where you may want to remember this moment in your design. That could be used as a version. Releases are really about formal approvals and moving the design forward to a state that, it's meant to signify something, right? So just keep in mind, versions are absolutely useful as milestones that you may want to come back to. Maybe it's a long day's work, or maybe it's the design reaches a certain state where, it's reviewable by another person, but it's nowhere near ready for a formal approval. Well, that may be a moment to create a version, right? Releases are really about, gathering all the metadata, gathering the collection of all the things that need to be formally approved and doing that, right? And so that's the distinction I would make between the two. I hope that's clear. Another question, can I show the state in the bill of materials? Yes, this is, in my opinion, one of the easiest ways to, at a glance, see kind of the state of everything in my assembly. All right, so you can add a column with the state in your bill of materials. And when I click the BOM table, it flies out, and I see the state of all my parts or subassemblies in the BOM table. It's just an easy way to do that. You can also, of course, go to the Workspace Properties and things like that. But showing the state in the bill of materials is a question that's come up, and I think it's a common way, an easy way to, at a glance, see everything in the assembly and where it's at in the workflow. Right? What about standard content? Standard content, or what about things that I don't want to revision manage? First off, standard content is not included in release candidates. It's not revision managed, right? So you don't have to do anything special for standard content. That's automatically done for you. So if the nuts and bolts, you insert using standard content will just be excluded. There's also the concept of non-revision managed. So if you go into your Workspace Properties, there's a checkbox for non-revision managed. And you can control who is allowed to check that. But that's what controls whether the revision gets incremented when you create a release candidate. So let me dive into this just briefly because I think it's important. If you have those library parts or those things that you don't want to be bumping revisions, maybe they're just kind of standard hardware for you, you could go into the Workspace Properties and define it as non-revision managed, right? You'll see it, not revision managed, is a checkbox here. And that just means that when you go to create a release candidate, it's not going to bump the revision, right? It's not going to do any of that. So just keep that in mind. That is a question that comes up often. You can set this to where only the admin has this control, and that's up to you. But by default, everything except standard content is going to have its revision incremented. It's that's just the nature of it. So the other thing to point out, you can create a release candidate right from here. Kind of a neat little tip from the Workspace Properties. There's this button for release, right? Forgive me, we have 1 minute left, and I have a few questions outstanding. One last thing that I wanted to mention, a question that's come up often: can I automate things as part of when a design changes state? Can I automate things as a part or an assembly or drawing changes state? For instance, one of the most common questions I get asked is, if something's released, can I automatically save a PDF of a drawing and put it somewhere? And the short answer is no, not today. There's automation for the notifications, which I showed you, but there's no way to trigger things happening based on state changes as of today. All right, aside from the options and the things that we discussed, but there's no way to build on top of that as of today. And again, key thing to keep in mind is a moment in time, so that won't be a limitation forever. But as of today, there's no way to automate, exporting of things or, aside from the notifications that I showed you. All right, so those are the list of FAQs that I wanted to make sure that I got to. I know there are quite a few out there that I have outstanding in the list, so forgive me. I am going to stick around for a few more minutes and make sure to get all of those answered. Thank you, everyone, for joining. One final thing to point out, if you're interested in learning more, if you're interested in learning Onshape, maybe you're new to Onshape, or you're just interested in getting more familiar with certain aspects of Onshape, the Onshape Learning Center is really a valuable resource for learning Onshape. Anywhere from basic sketching all the way up to in context and sheet metal and all those more advanced features that we have, all covered in the Onshape Learning Center. So definitely check it out if you haven't already. So that's what I had planned. Forgive me, we are 1 minute over, so I'm going to wrap things up here, but I am going to stick around and answer any questions. So feel free to stick around if you have any outstanding questions. I'll make sure to get to them. But that's it, everyone. Thank you and have a good day.